who will introduce the panelists. There'll be a very fulsome discussion on the topic of nominating and corporate governance matters. Then there'll be a Q&A, and feel free to, for the Q&A, to start putting your questions in the chat function, and Alison Gray will monitor that. And then I will come back on and provide thank you closing remarks. And then we've got a networking session with breakout groups, and our moderator and panelists will facilitate those breakout groups. So hopefully you can stay with us. By way of background, I'm Deborah Rosati, founder and CEO of Women Get On Board. Delighted to have you all here today. Women Get On Board is a member-based company that connects, promotes, and empowers women to corporate boards. And our goal is, by having a community, a diverse community across Canada, is to get more women on boards. And today is our empowerment session with our virtual session. We want to thank our national strategic partner, Gallings, for sponsoring this event. And we have a very fulsome discussion. So I will do an introduction to our moderator, Alison Gray. Alison Gray is a partner with Gallings. Yes, lovely photo, Alison. She's a partner in the advocacy department of Gallings' Calgary office. She maintains a diverse commercial litigation practice with an emphasis on complex litigation matters, including shareholder disputes, oppression actions, civil fraud, and asset recovery claims, and energy-related disputes. I certainly wouldn't want to be on the other side of you, Alison. Alison has extensive experience representing companies and directors and officers in civil actions and class actions in relation to investigations and prosecutions by securities regulators. She also has acted as counsel to special committees undertaking investigations into financial irregularities and whistleblower complaints. So over to you, Alison, our esteemed moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. And we are very excited to be hosting this webinar today with Women Get On Board. And thank you to all the attendees for joining us today. As Deborah said, we will hold a Q&A session at the end, but please feel free to put any questions in the chat during the discussion. And if there's a specific person you'd like to answer a question, please indicate that as well. And I will try and make sure that question gets before the right person. And you may hear us use the abbreviations NCGC or NGC instead of using the full Nominating and Corporate Governance Committee phrase, as that is a bit of a mouthful, so we may abbreviate it for convenience. For this webinar today, we decided that rather than addressing the current corporate governance climate generally and the issues facing boards as a whole, that we would ask our panelists to share their views on the roles that the NCGC specifically play in responding to the issues that are impacting the discussions around the board table today. Our three panelists are Judith Athaide, Patty McLeod, and Greg Peterson. Judith is an accomplished corporate director, entrepreneur, professional engineer, and certified corporate director. She brings 25 years of executive and corporate governance experience to board discussions. Judith is currently serving on a number of boards, including the board of Computer Modeling Group, HSBC Bank Canada, New Brunswick Power, where she is the lead director on enterprise risk management, Tri-Summit Utilities, where she chairs the Health, Safety and Environment Committee, and Sustainable Development Technology Canada. Patty McLeod is a businesswoman and a lawyer with extensive experience in governance and leading transformational change and resilience in complex organizations. She currently serves on numerous boards, including as the board chair of Calgary Cooperative Association, the Real Estate Council of Alberta, and the Calgary Film Center. She is also a board director of Alberta Innovates, the Beverage Container Management Board, and the Green Line Board, overseeing the $5 billion transit infrastructure mega project in Calgary. Greg is a partner and leader of the Corporate Finance, M&A, and Private Equity Group in Gowling WLG's Calgary office, and leader of Gowling WLG's National Governance, Activism, and Investigations Group. Greg has extensive background in complex public and private, corporate and commercial matters. He has also has extensive experience in governance and has served and continues to serve on numerous boards and has acted as counsel to special committees of various boards. With those introductions done, let's hear from our panelists. So to get us started, Greg, you've served as a corporate secretary to the board for a number of your clients. From your perspective, what is the purpose and role of the NCGC?
Okay, first, thank you, Alison. It's a pleasure to participate in this webinar today. As a partner of Gallings, we're thrilled to be involved with the Women Get On Board group in this initiative. So to answer your question, the main role and purpose of a nominating and governance committee is to, number one, take the lead in identifying director candidates for an election at the board's annual general meeting. Number two, recommend corporate governance principles and practices to incorporate into the company. This could include recommending actions that the board should take to ensure that the company is complying with its governance guidelines and policies and its legal and fiduciary duties. And number three, take the lead in assessing the effectiveness of the board. Now, having said that, one of the main reasons why we're having this webinar today is to make all of us more appreciative of the reality that over the past few years, the role and the purpose of a nominating and governance committees dramatically changed. The attitude towards nominating and governance committees has shifted to a higher level of expectation and performance, and really a higher level of importance. And I remember way back earlier in my legal career, it used to be that the nominating and governance committees were sarcastically referred to as the nominal committees. That's because it was often that the NGC committee was the committee that you planted those directors who didn't have sufficient financial or industry knowledge to serve on either the audit or the compensation committee, or they didn't understand the business well enough to serve on other committees such as a reserve committee or a compliance committee or a safety committee. And it used to be that the NGC committee met maybe once or twice per year. They followed the same cookie cutter agenda that the previous year had, with an occasional search for a director. But because of regulatory pressure and new legislation, it forced audit committees and compensation committees to change. For example, in the early 2000s, the audit committee came under the spotlight and was forced to respond to all the accounting scandals that took place in the early 2000s. And the outcome of those scandals was that the implementation of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in the States and Bill 198 in Canada. So those pieces of legislation required the audit committee to really upgrade and better monitor the company's financial operations and reporting. And then in 2011, we had the compensation committee come under the spotlight, and it was forced to respond to all the compensation scandals in 2010. So the outcome of those scandals resulted in, down in the States, you had the Dodd-Frank legislation, and in Canada, you had legislation that really required compensation committees to upgrade and better disclose companies' executive and director compensation matters. So today, we have the Nominating and Governance Committee that is now under the spotlight. And it's not because of any regulatory pressure or new legislation, but it's more because of the scrutiny and pressure that investors are placing on boards regarding various governance matters. And some of those matters that we're seeing are ESG, environmental, social, and governance matters. They're being pushed by various shareholder groups and becoming a greater focus for today's NGC committees. Diversity matters such as gender, racial, and ethnic diversity, they're becoming important considerations for any nominating and governance committee. In fact, regulators are asking companies to adopt policies and ensure that women and people of color are on the initial list of every open board seat, as well as for CEO appointments. In addition, companies are now being required to publish their efforts to improve board diversity. A third thing is there's an increase in shareholder activism on issues, and it seems to be falling on the plate of the nominance and governance committees. Fourth, there's a push by investors to ensure that boards are better recruiting board members and the need to more often refresh the board. And that's led to the NGC committees conducting more robust and probing individual director assessments prior to re-nomination and prior to or during board recruitments. CEO tenors are shrinking. That's putting pressures on the Nominating and Governance Committee to have in place succession plans. Climate change is another emerging matter for Nominating and Governance Committees. And I don't think we've seen an end to all the emerging issues that are falling on the plate of the Nominating and Governance Committees. So you can see by that list that I just rattled off that the NGC committee's purpose and role has dramatically expanded over the past 5 years, where today that committee's importance is on par with the audit and the compensation committees. And I guess in summary, Alison, I'll say no longer can a Nominating and Governance Committee be considered the nominal committee, and no longer can that committee kind of place its second team of directors. It's now a very important committee for the board.
Alison,
Judith, sorry.
Could I just join in with what Greg said, if you don't mind?
Absolutely.
I think what Greg said, he said it so well. I think he said essentially that in 2021, the NG committee is not our father's NG committee, because everything is coming to the board through the NG committee. And so I think of the NG committee as sort of the keeper of the governance flame. And you can't let the flame go out, because if you do, bad things happen. Your cost of capital goes up, you lose your employees, it's hard to find new employees. Customers aren't happy, they may not repeat purchase. Communities don't like what you're doing, they may not welcome you. So it's a really interesting place to be. It's a tough place to be because there are no easy answers. But I've come to the realization, if you have a chance to serve on the NG committee, put up your hand, because it's a really interesting place to be. So thank you for letting me pipe in.
Yeah, I'd like to actually add a comment. One of the things I think many board directors may have observed is that quite often it's a governance and compensation committee, or it's a governance and HR committee, or even a governance and compliance committee. I think of my about a dozen boards I've served on over the past 10 years. I've only got one that ever had a governance committee. So it is very common, and I think it's kind of indicative of what Greg was saying, that governance was an add-on or not necessarily seen. But what is starting to become apparent is the amount of time that governance is taking is actually impeding. It's become a very large workload and work plan for the committee because of the work that's associated now with ensuring effective governance oversight and meeting the duties and expectations of the board. So it's just something to be really conscious as we look at this evolution. One of the things boards can do is actually start looking and saying, have we not only got the right skills on that committee, but are we giving it enough time and focus to meet the emerging issues that are coming? One of the other things that I think is pivotal to excellent board performance is the chair CEO role. And in boards that I chair, the committee I rely on the most is the governance committee. I think the governance committee can really, really support the effectiveness of the chair and the chair management relationship. And so those are a couple of places I think that are really evolving as governance evolves, to look at the role of this committee and ensure it has the resourcing and time that it needs to meet the mandate that we're going to be discussing.
Great. Thank you, Patty. Judith, you've been a corporate director for 2 decades, and you've served on a number of kinds of boards. You've been on public boards, private boards, Crown and not-for-profit boards in a variety of sectors, including like energy, power and utilities, financial services, professional services, software. That experience must have given you insight into what makes NGCs effective. Could you share your thoughts with us about what it is that makes for an effective NCGC? And are there ways to measure that effectiveness?
I think I am I, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I wasn't sure if I was muted or not. 2 really good questions, Alison, thank you. I think there are several factors that really support the committee's effectiveness. And I think it starts with the chair. Having an experienced and skilled chair is really important, one who listens more than they speak, and one who's able to encourage every member around that board table to bring their own opinions and experience to the table, and is able to lead the committee through what I would say is very reasoned, deliberated consensus. And what I say to you about the NG committee obviously is also equally true for the board. I think the second thing that's really important for the NG committee to be effective is that every member of the committee must understand the strategy of the organization, because it's in understanding the strategy of the organization that you know if you are aligned to the purpose of the organization and the culture of the organization, and you know that the policies and the frameworks you're putting into place actually support you being able to deliver into the strategy and creating long-term value. And then I think the other things that are important is that the members of the committee have to be following securities legislation and regulation as it impacts them if they're a public company. And whether you're public, crown, not-for-profit, I think it's really important to be monitoring and having really good discussion at the committee table on emerging governance trends. And how they apply to your organization. And that's true whether you're a large cap, small cap, not-for-profit. And I think the last part for me that comes to mind is it comes back to what Greg said when he started, which is the importance of clear roles, terms of references, work plans for all committees. So those are some of the things I think that help support effectiveness. Your second question about can you measure effectiveness? I'd like to say, you know, it's like when I see it, I'll know it. But I think there are a few things you can absolutely look at. Starting with the cost of capital. What's your cost of capital relative to your peers or relative to the riskiness of the business? If your cost of capital is higher, that means that the debt markets and the capital markets think you're riskier. And so why do they think you're riskier? And how does that risk come back to your governance structure and model? So that's the first place to start. I think the other things that help you measure how effective you are is the debate and dialogue at the meeting table. Is your debate diverse? Are you encouraging divergent perspectives? Or is everyone bringing the same perspective every single time so that you're not getting the diversity? How are you managing your time is something I'd be looking at. Are you spending your time on rear view mirror issues, or are you looking at strategic front windshield matters? How are you communicating beyond finance and risk? Those are two areas that most committees and most boards are really good at, but how well are you integrating your ESG matters? How well are you talking about health, safety, environment, climate change, cyber, and that whole list of things that are important and come under ESG? I'd say who controls the agenda? Is it the committee chair with the support of the corporate secretary, or is it the management team? As a board member and as an NG committee, you should be controlling the agenda for that committee. Other things I would look at is, are directors aligned? Are their interests aligned with the interest of the firm? And so that kind of comes back to, especially for public companies, what does their compensation look like? And what does the share ownership guidelines look like? Are they appropriate? And the last thing that comes to my mind is, do you have a robust, open, transparent process for evaluating directors' performance, committee performance, and the board performance? And just as importantly, do you have the commitment of the chair and chairs of the committee and the board to act on the results? So those are some of the things that I think you can look at to say, are we being effective? Starting with what's our cost of capital? That's the market speaking to your effectiveness, to the more internal metrics of how are we behaving. Those are the things that come to mind, but I'm going to ask Patty and Greg to chime in.
Go ahead, Patty. I'll follow you.
There can be nothing left. I think Judith took it all. You know, I always say to some extent, you know, the governance committee really does support the balance of the board and the board chair with ensuring that all parts of your fiduciary are being met. And Judith mentioned terms of reference and work plans and board effectiveness surveys and all that kind of thing. But I like to see a governance committee almost as a gatekeeper to say, okay, emerging issues, do we understand where things are on the work plans? And do we have a sense that they're being accomplished? The other thing I think a governance committee really has an opportunity to increase effectiveness is in the performance side around skills development, skills assessment, board education, ensuring that the strategic discussions are happening. What kind of balance do you have in your agendas? I mean, this is work done with a board chair, but are we talking about compliance checklist matters a lot, or are we really getting into generative conversation? And I think that a governance committee having a really regular cadence of review and assessment, even attendance, boy, there's one thing that tells you your board is not effective is if your board members aren't showing up. So, all of these kinds of things are really critical for, effectiveness, but actually things that the governance committee can lean into.
Yeah, and for the past 30 years of my legal career, I've served on about 15 boards, 3 nominating and governance committees, and I've been involved with many boards as legal counsel and corporate secretary. And the only reason I say that is because one thing I have learned in my experience with boards is that no 2 boards are exactly alike. Every board's different. Every board has its own chemistry. Likewise, I don't think any 2 nominating or governance committees are exactly alike. Every nominating and governance committee is different, and every committee has its own chemistry, its own dynamic, its own makeup of personalities with their experiences and expertise. And I don't think there's a formula or mold that a nominating and governance committee can simply duplicate to ensure that it's effective. What might work for one NGC committee may not work for another. On the other hand, what might not work for one NGC committee may work for another. In addition, and Judith touched on this, things that make a small cap NGC committee effective may be different than the things that make a mid cap or a large cap committee effective. A small cap NGC committee has different needs and requirements than a mid cap and a large cap. And many times in my experience with boards, I've seen small cap companies just incorporate, they're all public knowledge, but they just incorporated some very large cap board committee policies, procedures, and mandates. And it just didn't work. It didn't fit. It was like trying to put a round peg in a square hole. So having said that, I think, and even public and private companies are different. And there's even difference between various levels of private company. So having said all that, the first thing I believe that should be done when you make a nominating and governance committee effective is to make sure that the committee's mandate, policies, and procedures fit the type of company it is, whether it's small cap, mid cap, large cap, private, or public, because they should be different. There are similarities, but they should be different. And the other thing I can't emphasize enough from my observation, and Judith totally touched on it, is how important the chair is. But I'll just add to what Judith said. I've been involved with some NGC committees where the chair was knowledgeable in governance, but the chair was not totally bought in and committed to the governance matters. And that committee did not work. Obviously, I'm not going to name it. So I think if you're going to get a chair of the NGC committee, that person has to be not only knowledgeable, but totally committed to all these governance issues that we've talked about. They have to believe in ESG. They have to believe in diversity. They have to believe in shareholder engagement, board recruitment, board refreshment, CEO succession planning. If they don't, your NGC committee is just not going to work.
Thanks, Greg. And just continuing on this theme of board effectiveness and board effectiveness being linked to, board renewal and succession planning. Patty, given your experience, can you speak to how a board should recruit new members and how they can onboard them?
Well, and following on Greg's comment, I mean, that is going to be a process as unique to the nature of the organization and board, as any. But there's some common best practices. First of all, I believe very strongly that it's probably, in my opinion, a mistake to try and recruit to fill every skill in a skills matrix. So bring on, you want technology or IT, so you bring on somebody who's just a deep IT expert. I start with a fundamental of all directors need to understand the core governance and fiduciary duties, and they need to understand the role of being a director across the organization. And that includes, some financial literacy, some ability to translate the content of the industry and the nature of the company. So, successful recruitment certainly does get into skills matrix, but you have to have a good base of understanding of being a director. Or you're really going to be challenged with a lot of special interests. I've actually, God bless him, but I met an accountant who said, well, I'm clearly here to be on the audit committee, and I don't have a lot of interest in diving into the other discussion points. And that was not successful. And that person did not last in the long run, because you really don't come on to just only contribute in a lane. Secondly, recruitment, I think, is getting far more attention around the conscious effort of building the position profile, really understanding what you are as an organization, what your strategy is, and what kind of oversight, input, and skills background you need to build a strong board and the diversity of that board. And I want to come back, on another point to equity and diversity and inclusion, but just really building around the idea that you want to have a diverse board from a skills perspective, from a number of other factors. It all goes into the description of the role, because if you're only really willing to accept CEOs from your industry that all know each other, you got a pretty small pool. And so it really is opening up that posting and not saying, well, geez, why aren't we getting people that have this background or this type of diversity? Is, well, what kind of parameters and criteria have you put on the posting that is discouraging qualified people that might be different? So the job posting of director and what you're seeking and what you're going after is really, really critical. I think it's really important to involve your management in assessing who you need on the board. They know if they're strong management and have a good relationship with the board. I think it's really important to bring forward their perspective on skills that they would really like to tap into. So I think it's an important part of assessing. And then, now you see boards reaching out. Women Get on Board, for example, has the ability to build into the network. Recruiters, ICD, all kinds of agencies are building accessibility for different pools of people than perhaps a board sort of traditionally knew or knew of through their networks. And so I think it's really obvious best practice to break out of the who you know and try to tap into different networks. From the perspective of onboarding, the effectiveness of bringing new members in, this is, I think, an area where there's a lot more effort that I'm seeing going into onboarding. It's not just sit down for 3 hours and hear a bunch of information and walk away, you're ready to go. It is much more iterative. I think over the last year and a half, onboarding has, of course, been virtual, but it has allowed us to break up onboarding. I've joined 2 boards virtually, haven't met anybody yet, and I've also onboarded members. And I think the orientations are getting better and better because we're using the technology as an opportunity to do shorter, focused sessions. Highly recommend and finding a lot of success in buddying and making sure that we're matching board members, new board members with existing board members, and really seeking feedback and continuous improvement in that process, allowing members to say, well, I know I joined 9 months ago, but I either didn't take it in when it came the first time, or I now have a context for information that I'm not sure I actually completely have placed this appropriately, and allowing that onboarding to not just be a one and done, allowing it to be continuous. And as a matter of fact, we had some board members that came on last year. We did orientation for new board members this year in the board I'm on, and those board members came back because now they actually said, wow, now it makes sense. So really encouraging that continuous process, I think, really helps you improve. And the governance and nominating committee has a very significant role in the recruitment and the onboarding process.
We had a question in the chat asking how ESG fits into the skill matrix of selecting a new director. Judith or Greg, do you have any comments on that question?
Go ahead, Greg.
Judith. Okay. Well, I don't. ESG is just an important issue that has to be addressed by the nominating committee. When Patty was saying the skill matrix, I think she was more talking about the fact that you don't want to. Okay, we don't have a lawyer on our board, so we got to go get a lawyer. We don't have an accountant on our board. We got to go get an accountant. Those are the usually two ones you have to. That's not necessarily the case. I think what Patty was saying is no, you go and get someone who is the best qualified. Now, obviously, on every board, and anytime you go public, I've been through this many times. The stock exchange will say, okay, do you have somebody who has industry experience? Do you have somebody who has governance experience? That's kind of important for a board. So when those issues come up in the board meeting, but when it comes to ESG matters, it's more, those are the matters that the nominating governance committee are going to have to address. And you want members of that committee sufficiently knowledgeable and, as I indicated, sufficiently committed to address those issues. Judith, I don't know if I answered that good enough or not, but I'll leave it to you to spruce it up.
Oh, I don't think it needs any sprucing, Greg. I think I absolutely agree with what you said. I wanted to do a shout out to what Patty said, which I thought was really, really important. And she said two main things that I think worth repeating. The first thing is she said is stop fishing in the same pond, look at other ponds to fish in when you're trying to put together a diverse board. And the second thing she said on onboarding, which I really liked, is get a board buddy. Right? Have a board buddy to help through that onboarding process. And I think those are really two good pieces of advice. I want to touch something that I think Patty was a little bit diplomatic and didn't touch on, which is when we look, most boards, and certainly most public boards, in order to respond to the OSC's comply or explain regime, talk about merit. Almost all boards do, not everybody does, but most do. And I want to just explore that thought a little bit more about merit in the context of diversity. And I would say to you that investors absolutely want directors who are experienced in their area of expertise, who are qualified to serve, and who have demonstrated what I call the table stakes: ethics, sound judgment, ability to be diplomatic, but be part of courageous conversations. But investors also want the superior returns that companies with diverse boards earn. And research has shown that companies that have diverse boards outperform their peers. So to go back to what Patty says, if you're looking for candidates and they're all starting to look like you, so they're more engineers, more lawyers, more accountants, more energy, more whatever, then you've probably put too much reliance on merit. So start fishing in other ponds. That's what I would add in. Thank you.
And
Alison,
I just want to add one more comment that came to my mind about when Patty was talking, and that's, I think you should always keep an active list of potential candidates. I was legal counsel to one board that always did that, and almost every board meeting, they would go through the list, even though they weren't actively out there recruiting. So I think it's an effective thing to do is start compiling names and thinking about potential candidates well in advance of when you actually plan to recruit. You'll provide the pool of candidates. They'll always be there. And it's clear that the nominating and governance committee, they're responsible for identifying the director candidates, but I believe it's beneficial to the committee if the entire board provides names and resumes of potential committee and potential board candidates. And another thing, I think it was both Patty and Judith who said that a job description and expectation documents. Again, I'm just going by my own observations as legal counsel to a number of boards. One board, they kept a expectation document, and they put in that what each board member is required to do. So when the time came to recruit a board member, then they had that document ready to go. And I've noticed that it almost, I don't want to say it made board members feel guilty, but it made them do a self-check at that time when they're going through this expectation document of what they want future board members to be. The last thing I'll just comment on is, if you're a small cap company, and that's mostly who I've acted for, startup companies and companies that are on the TSXV, junior companies, they're often going after very experienced board members. And in some ways, you're there to do a sales job. and you're there sometimes even compete in some, if they're a good board member, they're probably getting asked to be on other boards. And if you want them on your board, you have to do a pretty good sales job in the fact that you have to be organized, and they're going to look at your expectation document. They're going to look at what you're doing, how you're recruiting them, and they're going to ask questions. So you just have to have that orientation process ready to go. And I think it'll help you, especially for small cap, not so much mid cap or large cap, but for small cap company looking for a good board member, that will really show your professionalism to bring in quality board members.
Great, thanks so much, Greg. So let's switch gears a little bit. We've got about 10 minutes or so left in the panel discussion. And we've definitely touched on some emerging issues throughout the panel discussion. And let's see if we can't dig into that a little bit more. And maybe we can do this in a bit of a lightning round, starting with Judith and then going to Patty and Greg. What is an emerging issue you think that boards and specifically the NCGCs need to be keeping in mind in this day? Judith?
Okay, Alison, I don't know if I can do this in a lightning round because I think it's a really important topic that I want to put out there as an emerging issue, and that is shareholder democracy. So 2 weeks ago, this tiny activist firm that almost nobody had heard about, that was only 6 months old, took on a massively large public cap that's been around for more than 100 years called ExxonMobil, and they won. So engine number one, the tiny activist investor, was formed in December 2020. And when they were formed, they went to the board of Exxon and they said, look, we're looking to have new directors elected to the board that are independent from the current board and independent from the current CEO, who can take a look at the strategy, can provide an independent review, and can essentially see if it's still appropriate, because we think there have been years of value destruction. They were not looking towards putting their own directors on the board. They were just saying to the Exxon board, let's get some new directors on. So at that time, I want to point this out, engine number one owned 0.02% of the outstanding shares, not 2%, 0.02%. And conventional wisdom tells us that you need between 3% and 5% to have any chance of being successful as an activist. So wisdom is saying we need more than 150 times what engine number one had. So the Exxon board did not listen to engine number one. They dismissed it. And that really required engine number one to be a little bit more, what would I say, creative. And so they turned to the big boys, the heavyweights. They went to State Street, they went to Vanguard, they went to BlackRock, and they went to CalPERS. And together, the four of them and a few others put forward a slate of 4 candidates. And I just want to talk about who these candidates are because it's pretty amazing. So between the 4 candidates, 2 of them on multiple occasions had been determined to be the best performing CEOs in the world. Best performing CEOs in the world by Harvard Business Review. One was named as the best business person of the year by Fortune magazine. One was awarded the leader of the top most difficult business transformations, the top 20 most difficult business transformations. One is the ex-US Secretary of State, the current senior strategist at Google Innovation Lab, and a scholar at Stanford School of Civil and Environmental Engineering. 2 of the 4 came out of the C-suite of large public oil refining and marketing firms, the exact business that Exxon is in. And the 4th is the ex-CEO of the world's largest wind manufacturer. So when you look at those 4, you would say, I certainly say, that there is no inexperienced, passionate ideologue amongst any of them. All 4 are accomplished business people. They have deep energy industry experience, and they have performed in the top decile for their industry based on all the awards and recognitions they have. As we know, 3 of the 4 have been elected. And what I find interesting is that post-election, some have suggested that this is a watershed moment for climate change. I'd say it's a watershed moment for corporate governance and shareholder democracy. So that's why I wanted to go first. And I would say that we've all, as board members, been put on notice now that no matter how small an investor is, they have a voice and they want to be heard, or they will find a way to make their voice heard. The other thing I want to say is I found it really interesting that engine number one, that has only been around for 6 months, was able to effect the election of 25% of Exxon's board. They were more successful in 6 months than the OSC's comply or explain regime has been in 6 years. So if we want to change diversity on boards, then shareholders will have to speak up. And we're starting to see that with CPPIB, PSP, RBC Asset Management, AIMCO, and others. So that is shareholder democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. Hattie.
Whew, I don't know how to follow you, Judith. You
are going to be.
I'm just saying that's, it is a fascinating situation. What's really remarkable is those names would have been presented to Imperial's board, and their nominating or governance committee or whomever chose not to just accept those individuals and turn that into a battle. And that's what seems even more amazing when you think about the caliber of those individuals. Not disparaging anybody that was there, but to me, I take away, don't get a sense of entitlement around your board roles, and be really willing to see that turnover and that refreshment, and particularly when you're seeing agitation for it. My lightning round, and I did see some questions about diversity and skills matrix, and what you're looking for, and how do you know whether what you're looking for in diversity is sort of tokenism versus really effective. And I think, what I would comment in respect of all of that, I hope is helpful, is it's really about what is appropriate diversity for your organization. So there's a combination of social movements right now that are saying our boards are not reflective of society, of our customers, of our stakeholders, of our communities. And so a really genuine assessment of that and the nature of your organization is very, very important. That's what moves you away from this is just, kind of tokenism or for show, versus something that, really becomes part of that value proposition that Judith was talking about. That's what's going to deliver results, is if it's authentic to what your organization needs. I think another thing that's really important about diversity is gender, person of color. These are binary. These are things we feel good about because we can look and we think that we've assessed it by our visual cues. But diversity is much broader than that. And so it's really important, again, to go back into that assessment, not only of what would be important for us to deliver better outcomes for the organization, but to really understand what we have. And the real challenge of diversity is asking those questions to know what you have. Not everybody wants to disclose, gender sense of who they are, or backgrounds, diverse backgrounds. And so it becomes a real challenge in that assessment. But I think it's a combination of really taking a good hard look at what you actually have. It's quite easy to look at a board of 12 white 60-plus-year-old men, and so you say, well, we make an improvement just by making sure there's some women there, or individuals of color, or maybe somebody who's younger. But what is the real diversity that's going to bring forward the experiential perspectives to challenge, to bring more effectiveness to our board discussions? And I think that's the difference from just doing something for show so that you don't have to explain you've complied, but is really thoughtfully going to add. I think the second piece of diversity, everybody knows this, but I think that this is where the money really makes a difference, is how do you include that diversity? How do you value what? And the governance committee has a large role when you think about board effectiveness in really assessing. So we've put diversity on our board. We've put a younger person. We've put a person that's sort of non-traditional industry. Is that person getting a chance to speak up? Are we giving them the other education to make sure that they're, conversant at the board table and have the ability to contribute? Do we have some considered visible minorities at the table, but they're just not being recognized for their commentary. What can we do to support and ensure that their voices are heard? Those inclusiveness practices, I think, are what makes diversity effective.
Okay, thanks, Judith and Patty. Some really good comments. So first, I'll maybe just go back and touch a little bit on what Judith said about the Exxon case, and I love how she framed it. To me, when I read that situation, not case, but to me it was failure. It taught me failure to engage shareholders. In this case, it was about climate change, but I think you can add or any other emerging issue will lead activists to file proposals at AGMs. And if boards refuse to answer shareholder activist questions, the shareholders are going to look to replace the directors who will. And I honestly believe that there's emerging issues that are going to fall down on the Nominating and Governance Committee that we haven't even talked about. We just, 1 year ago today, you couldn't rattle off what the emerging issues were for a Nominating and Governance Committee. And I think 1 year from now, there could be others, which leads, I guess, to my final point. And that's, I think, an emerging issue for NGC committees is the question, is the responsibility bucket already too full for one committee? The NGP bucket used to be, it was two duties: nominate directors and oversee board governance. Well, now you have shareholder engagement matters. Now you got corporate culture matters. Now you got ESG matters. All these matters we've been talking about, and this is just my question, is this going to be too much for one committee? And if it is, you might have to split it up into a couple of committees and delegate it. You can delegate to the committee that role, but you can never delegate that duties of your fiduciary duties of the board. And I guess I'll just a concluding comment that I'll say, and I stated earlier that the NGC committee is no longer a nominal committee, but it's a very important committee of the board on par with any other committee. It requires an outstanding committee chair, and it requires members who are the first team of your directors and totally committed to all these issues that are being placed onto this committee. And going forward, I just think it's going to be one of the more important committees that boards have to deal with.
Thanks, Greg. We are pretty much out of time for our panel discussion. That was an excellent discussion. And so we're happy to take any other questions that people may have. I see there's one question in the chat that's a bit of a, I guess, practical question. How do you handle it when you have highly qualified board members, but they're not very available, that they're very hard to get a hold of, or you have to go through assistants to get a hold of them, to be able to get them their attention for board meetings, committee meetings, or to have the one-on-one conversations? Does anyone have any thoughts about that?
Well, that comes down to a courageous leader, frankly. I think one of the challenges you see on boards is, and God bless them, but cachet names that are really there for profile, and maybe don't have the commitment to governance. But this isn't an off the side of your desk role anymore. And so I really believe that, if you're having somebody that is not just not doing the bare minimum. I mean, you can do the minimum, you don't have to do it all, but not available, non-responsive, it really does take identifying it, catching it early, being courageous with the board chair to have a conversation, maybe build some alternative paths to reaching them and giving those a try. But ultimately, that's board performance. And it's like any relationship in an organization, you have to manage performance. And if you're not willing to, bad behavior persists. But then you really see a board culture start to shift. And so I would suggest that you have to be willing to call that out respectfully, try to accommodate whatever the issues are, but set an expectation. I think it comes down to even what Greg said around board expectations and just really making sure you have commitment to those.
Yeah, I would add, I went first last time, Judith. You can go first this time.
Okay, thank you, Greg. I was going to say, I think you're more likely to see absenteeism on not-for-profit boards than you are on public cap boards. Sometimes you can't help but be absent, understood. But chronic absenteeism is often more likely on a not-for-profit board. And I can tell you that I served on a not-for-profit board for 7 years, and I overlapped with what I would call an iconic CEO, very well known. And we had, I think, 12 meetings a year, so a very heavy load as a not-for-profit. And in the 2 or 3 years that we overlapped, he never came to one meeting. So it takes a chair to sit down and say, look, it's okay if this is not the right board for you. We have limited chairs around the table, and every chair at the table must contribute. And perhaps this is not your time, right? So I think, as Patty says, you need a chair who can demonstrate the courage to have those difficult conversations, especially when you're having a conversation with what would normally be considered an iconic CEO of a large public cap, but you've got to do it.
Yeah, I totally agree with Judith and Patty. My thoughts were that you have to have a chair or somebody on the board that has to have a frank conversation and just say, "Are you committed to this board?" We never seem to. You have to have somebody just say that. It's almost their responsibility to make time. If you can't get them to go to a meeting because they're too busy doing other things, then it's not a priority to them. And I can speak from a little experience because of my nature as a lawyer. I was always the delegee to go tell that person that particular thing, and it's difficult, but you got to get your muster up. And I just think if you can't get them to go to board meetings, then they're not committed to your board, and you have to have a frank conversation with them about that they need to be committed. Difficult conversation, though.
Definitely. Thank you, Greg. So we have a question again along the ESG line. And the question really is, how does a board or the governance committee assess how deep you need to go into any one of the issues that fall into the ESG bucket with respect to, I guess, that particular board or organization? And I expect the answer is it kind of depends.
I think it depends. I think that if that ESG matter is material to the organization, if it poses a risk, then you as a board have an obligation to delve into it. You're not management. I understand that, but it's important that you understand what risk it poses and that it is properly being managed and mitigated by the management team. So it all comes down to materiality in my mind.
Yeah, I was going to say, and as some of the boards I'm on are really starting to delve into this. I mean, ESG is environmental, social, and governance. It's not a new invention. It's not a category of skill. It's a number of initiatives or risks to an organization in these categories that may have different relevance based on your strategy, your competition, your customers, your stakeholders. And so to me, I really tied it back to making sure that the governance committee actually led through the process of what is this ESG to us? How do we do a bit of an audit and assessment of, we do all kinds of things already in ESG. Every company has corporate philanthropy and cybersecurity measures, and there's a whole bunch of things we're doing. So how do we know what we're doing? How do we assess the risk or opportunity associated with them, and what is strategic? And then from the board's perspective, once that was understood, the second thing was, well, what leans into our, do we have strategic thrusts in those already, or these new initiatives? What are we going to do to monitor activity on these? And how are we going to measure and pay for performance? And those to me are the appropriate level for the board. It's up to management to execute. But, to me, it's identify, determine if it's relevant to your strategy or mitigating risk. And then ultimately it's about measurement and performance oversight.
Great, thank you, Patty. I think those are about all the questions. If anyone else has any questions, you can put it in the chat now, but I think those are pretty much all the questions that we have for now. So unless any great panelists have anything else to add, I will flip it back over to Deborah. And if there are any questions that we did miss in the chat, we will try and follow up with people, but I think that we managed to catch them all. So I will turn things back over to Deborah to introduce the next part of this evening.
Well, thank you, Alison. Thank you, Judith. Thank you, Greg and Patty. You showed up and leaned in. What a great conversation. I've got some quotes from each and every one of you, and I'm going to hold you to it. I chair a nominating corporate governance, and I had our corporate secretary on the on this virtual session as well. So I'm sure I'll be challenged even further. But anyway, I just wanted to thank Judith, Patty, and Greg for sharing your time and your insights, and Alison for managing through these very dynamic and very experienced board members, and Greg, from your perspective of not only advising your clients, but also serving as well. It was really great conversations. And Judith, the keeper statement of the day is nominating corporate governance committees are keepers of the governance flame. I will remember that dearly. There was a lot of other notable quotes, but thank you all. So just to reflect and thank you all, we will be making a donation on behalf of each and every one of you to our charity partner, which is Dress for Success, the Toronto chapter. And we want to thank Gowlings WLG as our national strategic partner. They have been with us since the very beginning of our events, and want to thank them for being a sponsor today, and Alison and Greg for your time. I just wanted to let everyone know our next Women Get On Board virtual session is going to be July 21st at 4 p.m. And it's kind of a little bit of a follow-on from this topic. KPMG is going to be our sponsor for that event, and it's around, is the board helping the business keep pace? And what we're going to do is have a touch point on the topic, but what we're going to do is to break into 3 committees and really spend the time on that topic with respect to either a nominating corporate governance committee, an audit committee, or HR compensation committee. And then we'll have very dynamic dialogue in those round tables based on the committees. So stay tuned. You will get a follow-up shortly after this session with a link to that session, with a link to a survey. We really, really appreciate your feedback. And then sometime early next week, you will get a link to the recording. So the recording will be available to all of you. So, so without further ado, what I'm going to do, Keisha, if you could pull up the final slide, we are going to go into networking sessions for breakout groups, and everyone will be assigned to a breakout room, so it'll randomly happen. Each room will be facilitated by our amazing panelist and our esteemed moderator. And really what we'll ask you to do is just go around, depending on how many are in your room, and just do a rapid fire introduction. So if I'm in your room, I'd say I'm Deborah Rosati, I'm founder and CEO of Women Get On Board, and I'm hailing from the Niagara region. Because we want everyone to introduce themselves, but we also want to have discussions that are unique to you and what are your experiences. Maybe you're not serving on a nominating corporate governance, but maybe there are matters, or you are, and you've got some issues that weren't addressed in the Q&A. And so really it's a great dialogue. You've got Greg, you've got Judith, you've got Patty, and you've got Alison, and they can guide that conversation with your peers. You will not be returning into the main room after the breakout session. So when you're done, my famous last words from RuPaul is, you will sashay away. And then just make sure that you connect with your group, whoever's in your breakout group, connect with them on LinkedIn. This is really an opportunity to ask questions about this topic and go deeper, but also to network. So did I miss anything, Keisha?
No, Deborah, I think you pretty much covered it all.
Okay, so everyone, we are going to go into breakout. Thank you again, Judith, Alison, Patty, and Greg, for your time. I've learned so much. I love hearing, and your interactions were so dynamic. Thank you all. So Keisha, you can work your magic now.
Great. I will now be opening the breakout rooms. Enjoy your networking session.